All right, so I think we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to a discussion about 2025 budget season. I'm sure everyone is getting started in the process and that it is our favorite time of the year, right? So we're thrilled at Dragonfly to be hosting this with Lighthouse and Montage International. I want to do a couple of intros and then we'll get started. We are going to leave the last 10 minutes for questions, so please drop them either in Q&A or chat and we will do our best to address them. If we don't get to everything, we'll be sure to get you a response when we send out the recording. Again, excited to have you here. I am joined by Sean Jareb, who is the Senior Vice President of Revenue Management and Distribution for Montage International. He's responsible for maximizing overall revenue and for really optimizing profitability at all the properties under the Montage International portfolio. He also develops revenue strategies to position the company for continued growth and sustainability. He joined Montage after 3 decades. I know he doesn't look like he's that old, but after 3 decades of hospitality experience, 26 of which focused specifically on revenue management. He was with Belmond in London as VP of Revenue and Distribution, and then more than 6 years with Morgan's Hotel Group. And he also held revenue management and sales roles with Starwood and Marriott. He attended Portland State University, where he studied business and science. Sean, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I just want to note that I did start when I was 10.
Okay, I knew there had to be some.
We all did. Yeah, we all did.
Child labor laws were different back then. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I'm sure. And then we're joined as well by Daniel Foreman, the commercial strategist from Lighthouse, a great partner of ours. He is spent the first decade of his career in revenue management, and now he works on the marketing team at Lighthouse, really creating educational content that is helping hoteliers get the most out of Lighthouse's commercial platform. And he also hosts a great podcast that you should be watching called The Spotlight, or listening to. And he is based in Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Last but not least is Elise Deeb, and she is our Chief Revenue Officer at Dragonfly. She and I have been together since 2016, building Dragonfly strategists together. And she leads our revenue and distribution team, as well as analytics and advisory on the revenue services side as well. Her background is she was SVP of Revenue Management for LQ, which when they asked her to join that company after being with Starwood and Omni, she thought it was a Mexican restaurant chain, La Quinta. Right, Elise?
Yeah, I had to learn very quickly what La Quinta really was. So it was, but it was a great select service hotel chain, not next to Denny's. That's not what everybody says La Quinta means, but it was not. So.
All right, awesome. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing the introduction screen there and get back so I can see faces, and we will get started. All right, so we did want to call this the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we all know that as we walk into this season, we all have mixed feelings about it. Most people I know just shake their heads and go, oh no, here comes 80-hour weeks to finish all the budgets, and then we're going to revise them, and then we're going to revise them again, and then we'll revise them again. And then owners might give us a number that we actually have to meet after we did all that work. So we're here to talk about, is there a different way to do this? And is there a way to make it a bit less painful for all of us involved in the process, but also make it accurate? And make it a budget that makes sense overall. So I'm going to get started with the first section. We're going to talk about debunking budget myths. So what are some common myths out there around hotel budgeting? Who wants to take this? Sean, do you want to start?
Common myths.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that budgeting is accurate is a really big myth.
That's a good one.
As my number one myth around budgeting. It's funny, I teach a lot of forecasting classes, and the first thing I teach when I teach forecasting classes is that the first rule of forecasting is that forecasts are wrong. And so I think that also applies to budgeting.
Very good. Elise, what do you think? What's another myth?
I think it's like field of dreams, right? You build it and it'll come. I think that's always interesting to me, that, you'll have expectations, which is what a budget is, right? Ownership expectations. And so the expectation is, a year from now, we're going to produce, 4 room nights in AAA on a Sunday. And I think, and we'll be talking more about what's important, not important when you're putting together the budgets, but just because you woulda, coulda, wish it doesn't mean it's actually gonna come to fruition. So
yeah, for sure. Daniel, anything to add to myths?
The myth that I'll add is that there's one like set right way to do it, and that all these companies like are all doing the same thing when they're budgeting. That is certainly not true, and definitely not from the select service space, which is where I come from. There have been some companies that I work for where I don't even touch the budget process as a revenue manager, and there's other companies where people are like, "Hey, Daniel, can you do our budget for us for these 20 hotels for next year?" And I'm the only person who's really touching it. So a lot of variety out there with how people are budgeting.
Yeah, for sure. Those are all good myths for us to debunk today. So, looking at a myth, how is it that you think, if you say that budgets are always inaccurate, forecasts are inaccurate, how do we communicate realistic goals for the next year to the teams who have to work on our budgets and actually deliver them and then present them to ownership? Elise.
I think from our perspective, gathering as much information as possible. I mean, everybody knows that you go to HDC and you're always waiting for the latest and greatest forecast, which, just was presented at NYU. And every year has changed 3 or 4 times. And again, it goes back to Sean's point that forecasting is not correct. I think, from our perspective, it's truly understanding trends. And it's not just the trends year over year, but it's even week to week, right? I know that, I've seen the booking window for group change dramatically after the pandemic, right? You had people coming back and everybody talked about revenge travel. And then everybody talked about, group coming back, corporate coming back, stabilization. But even stabilization now doesn't look anything like stabilization in 2019. And so I think from a perspective of, again, getting as much data as you can, not necessarily just from the people who, used to be Price Waterhouse and, they would do a forecast, or CBRE or LARC. Everybody has a forecast, but it's also understanding boots on the ground, right? Because, we have, convention centers that are going under renovation this coming year, and that's going to impact hotels. So really making sure you have a great relationship with, the operators, the sales and marketing folks that are, those are your hotels, because they do have a lot of great information and we should be listening to them as well. Not just, this is what I wish we would, grow next year.
Yeah, no, that's good. So how important do you think it is to budget by day and by market segment, Sean? Do you think that that's an important piece of this puzzle?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll add on to what Elise said. I mean, we also look at macroeconomics, which is super important, but I also think the devil's in the detail, right? So we have to do it by day and by segment, at least for us, just to understand critical things like shift in patterns, shift in school breaks, shift in holidays. All of those things really matter. They have a huge impact on our performance, particularly in the Montage brand, where our festive period will make up a huge amount of the revenue. And so understanding how are the Jewish holidays falling, where is Christmas falling, and understanding all of that is critically important. So we definitely do go by day and by segment. Also, group is a big lead indicator of, or a bellwether, if you will, of how you're going to perform, back to your point of, what are the targets? And so we really look at crossover. And so I think layering in that group first and understanding like, where's the group falling versus last year? How does that help us? How much of that is there is tremendously important, as well as the sort of macroeconomic view of, once you add that all up, what should it look like?
Yeah, very good. Do you think, we have had some circumstances where people have had a direction, or companies have had a direction to even go down to the rate code level or even the room type level for a budget. And to me, there is a granularity that is the right degree. What do you guys think about that? I mean, have you ever had to do it down and budget by room type?
No, but we get asked. It's funny you mention that. We have owners who, at some point during the year, even though they know we don't do this, will say, like, well, what did you budget for this? And I'm like, we don't budget by room category. Like, what are you talking about? So, I think the standard has always been by day, by segment, because the segmentation is really where I think the patterns are versus, the room type level. But it has been asked before, but we've never actually attempted to do it.
Understood. It seems like it would take a lot of time. I'll just put it that way, to do it, and then it's not going to be accurate. So,
right.
Because I think it gets too granular at that point. So, kind of flipping into tools and technologies. I mean, obviously, as an industry, we haven't always been on the cutting edge of technology, as we all know, and we haven't always had the best tools for our revenue teams and our finance teams to do a top line revenue forecast or bottom line expense forecast. So, what tools are you using? And I'm going to start with you, Sean. Go to Elise, and then I want Daniel to comment on tools that are available as an industry. But what tools, Sean, do you guys use during your budgeting process?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think historically we haven't had great tools, but they are starting to creep in, which is great. And so we're actually doing our first beta test year completely in a new tool for the first time. So my goal is to get us out of Excel, and this is the first year we will be 100% out of Excel for the budgeting process. So we are using, not to plug, but we are going to be using Ideas RevPlan. So we launched RevPlan a little over a year ago. And so we have been deep in the weeds with getting RevPlan in the water to have it available for this budgeting season. And the feedback has been phenomenal. Like, my team is over the moon. I had, directors of revenue say, I did our budget in days. Like, it's done. I'm already done. It's already out. Like, it's completed. And when we have to make changes, I can go in, I can, do a couple changes, easy, done, save, and it actually flows right back up into our finance system. So it's completely linked. So it's all data imported. There's no manual piece to it whatsoever this year.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah, we're very excited. We're very excited. It's, I think it's going to be a great tool. Still, it's in infancy, so I think it has a lot of room to grow. But, I applaud the Ideas team for taking on such a robust system. It actually forecasts all departments, right? So it's a fully automated forecasting system all the way down to profitability. So pretty incredible. And a pretty Herculean effort. So very impressive. A long way to go, I think. But, from a room standpoint, I think that's pretty nailed. And like I said, we've been very happy with it so far.
Excellent. Elise.
I think when we look at different RMSs, they all have a little bit different functionality when it comes to budgeting and forecasting, right? Is if you can get to a financial forecast outside of a demand forecast, which is different. We do like to use what's available to us because we oversee multiple brands, multiple hotels and ownership groups with multiple RMS systems. And so trying to sometimes bridge the gap, we have that universal where, obviously we still have the land of Excel, but we also try to look at forward-looking pricing, right? So Lighthouse is a partner, and we're always looking and we use their BI tool as well. And it has a component where it does have some budgeting that helps us get down to that sub-market level by day. But we do like to, again, as a gut check, looking at the pricing, the next 365 days and making sure that the achieved ADR is absolutely achievable, right? I think that there are times where people say, oh, well, we can grow 10% in ADR next year. And if the market doesn't sustain that, then it's pretty hard for you to be the outlier as the most expensive hotel if that's not the hotel that you're managing, right? The product. And so we do like to look a lot at the future, only because understanding the market demand and, there's market insight as well, just what's the shopping look like? I think, Sean, as you mentioned, we do have a lot of group houses, so understanding that crossover as well. I do think, and we'll talk more about technology as a gap, but certainly doing that ancillary spend, again, to Ideas, hats off to getting that piece right? Because I think from our perspective, we get so stuck in room revenue that we forget about all of the other ancillary spend that makes the guest worthwhile, right, to us, not just the room. So I think, again, pricing, looking at the analytics around, we also do a lot with the build from a waterfall heat map, looking at ADR and occupancy by month, just really understanding what's changed year over year, because you'll see a growth pattern. And again, you get into the month for the month, and even in forecasting where you'll have somebody say, oh, well, we can raise the ADR by $10. Well, if in the month for the month we've always lost 3, it's really hard to just switch on and change that delta. So I think just having a reality check is always good from our perspective, and we like to look at those types of analytical tools. So.
Yeah, and I think too, the positioning analysis that we have incorporated, at least for our clients, right? And really looking at where do you sit amongst the competition now? What's the guest sentiment? Are there new entrants? What's their day-by-day pricing? What room type pricing? What amenities do they have? Has anything changed? Is somebody's pool closed for a year? I mean, those types of things are important insights to have. So that you can create a budget that makes sense, right? And that is one that is a stretch. You want people to be stretched, but you also want to be sure that it's something that is achievable. So talking about tools and technologies, obviously, Daniel, you work at a technology company that provides the industry with a lot of tools. From that perspective, what do you believe are the best things to look at when you're going through and prepping and or walking through the budget process?
Yeah, sure. So to echo Sean's point earlier, I think the companies that are really kind of excelling right now, I shouldn't use that word, but that are like doing really well at the budgeting process right now are actually moving away from Excel. So what I'm finding is a lot of companies that are using like a financial BI solution alongside with a commercial BI solution, and especially if those two solutions link up, right? So if you can have your revenue manager, that's the person who's really doing the deep dive in the BI system, and maybe they're drafting up their budget and then they're pushing that to the financial BI system for further review. That tends to be a flow that I'm seeing that's working really well at a lot of companies right now. But yeah, there's a lot of tools out there. Obviously, I'm a little biased. I think Lighthouse BI is pretty awesome. But yeah, that's what I think is kind of a flow that's working for a lot of companies right now.
That's great. Yeah, in doing some of the search and selection we've done, we've looked at products out there like Oracle's EPM, for example, that is actually building a lot of AI into what they're doing in order to, and I think that's an area where obviously, I mean, RMSs have been using machine learning for years, but I think with generative AI now, that's an area that we can improve our accuracy and improve our ability to make rapid changes as we go through these change phases. But where do you see gaps in this process? And I'll start with you, Daniel. I mean, what are we missing as an industry? And maybe there are other industries that do this better. I don't know what your opinion is on that, but what are we missing?
Yeah, I would say a big thing that we're missing with the budgeting process is kind of that cross-department communication. So if I go in and I do a draft of a budget for 2025, a lot of times all people see is that top line number, right? That's all they're looking at. That's all they care about. I think a big improvement that we can make in our industry is backing up and explaining the why, right? So having a tool where we can get in there and we can say, hey, I increased our government budget for Q4 for weekdays by 5 rooms for each night. Here's why. And just having that whole like decision process kind of laid out a little bit more clearly so people can understand like, okay, why is the forecast changing? Why is the budget changing? I think that's kind of that next move is just that added communication, added clarity.
Other gaps, Elise or Sean?
I think from my perspective, we're missing micro, macro data. Which, if you attended HDC, the big word was bifurcation, right? So that was, and I think Elise touched on this as well. I think gone are the days of the forecast is X and we can all follow that. There's just so much difference post-pandemic in the way that each hotel market segment is recovering or growing. And so I think, we used to be like, oh, we get the star forecast and, 2, 3%, and that was for everybody. But I think now as you peel the onion, it's so vastly different, but you can't really get down to those levels very often in terms of outside data to really validate, I think, what we're doing for the greater stakeholders. So, they attend these events and they're like, okay, luxury is flat or luxury is going to grow X. But, that number is so skewed nowadays by, is that a luxury hotel in an urban market? Is that a luxury resort? Which part of the US? Again, everybody is so different nowadays that I find that some of that data can actually be more harmful than helpful because either they say we're going to do better or worse, and so they're not very good validations for, I think, the budgeting process, because we just don't have that more granular data that we need to really support what we're doing from an outside source, looking at from a macroeconomic standpoint. So I think right now that's one of the biggest holes for me, or challenges.
Elise, any comment on that?
I completely agree. And I think that's why we do a lot of our positioning analysis, which is different than a SWOT, but it's telling us, okay, again, this hotel renovated or closed off rooms or, added banquet space. I mean, all of those things just, become important, but more importantly is the customer sentiment, right? Because consumer behavior economics is something that we just don't lend enough to. And really, the voice of the stranger is more important than the voice of the brand, right? And we see that we do a lot in the independent space. And I think, when we look at customer sentiment, if you even look at how people sort or filter, right? If they're never going to look at a hotel that's less than, 8.0 or 4 stars, I mean, you lose so much just from a shopping and conversion perspective. And you see that in all the sentiment that's rolled out, whether it's Trip, Expedia, Booking, or Google. And so I think, having a plan and then, really incorporating those types of plans from an operations perspective that everybody is engaged, that, again, the budget isn't just this number in the sky that we're trying to achieve, that everybody lends to it and everybody can move the needle. And I would also say, again, AI is, I would love to have a budget that rolled out and said, oh, so in Paris, this is what happened in the Olympics. And when we get to LA during that season of Olympics, then this should be the expected lift, right? Because it's already been done somewhere else. And so how does that lean in? Or, the World Cup is coming sooner. So what does that mean in the finals to New York, based on the volume of hotel rooms available in the last World Cup? So I think that there's a lot that can happen with AI that could contribute to the budgeting process to make it a lot more thoughtful. And then based on, some type of history, even if it's happened somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Taylor Swift effect, just take it from one place to the other, and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah. Right. They talked about HDC. What's the next Taylor Swift, right?
Yeah.
And I think, at this point for us domestically is probably the World Cup and, on a smaller scale, the Olympics for LA.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'm going to switch a little bit because we've got about 10 minutes before we start taking questions. So I want to get to the last section. Please throw your questions into either chat or Q&A, and we will address those in a few minutes. So looking for some best practices. So the first question to throw out there is, what are some of the main challenges that hotels face in the budget process, and how can they be overcome? Daniel, I'm going to kind of throw that back to you because I know you touch with a lot of hotels that come to you and ask you for data and how do I get this? How can I look at this way, et cetera? What are some of the challenges hotels are bringing to you?
Big challenges that I'm seeing right now, first would be, obviously a lot of folks are still using Excel and like macro enabled workbooks. So, I'm sure a lot of us that are on the call right now can kind of relate to that challenge, right? Like, it's budget season. I'm going to crack open this Excel spreadsheet that I haven't opened since, January 7th of last year. And then the VBA is broken and something's not right, or we've changed our market segmentation standards. That's a really big challenge, is just like the infrequency at which we do budgeting kind of lends those manual tools to break like that. So that's always been a big challenge. And then also too, I would just say, data cleanliness. So kind of tying back into what I talked about with, hey, the VBA is broken because our market segmentation standards have changed. I'm finding that a lot of people, not only do they need to do their budget for 2025, but they also really need to go back and clean up a lot of their data from previous years, because so much of that weighs into what your budget's going to look like next year. So if you don't have a good understanding of your current rate plan production in 2024, your budgeting process in 2025 is going to be somewhat inaccurate. So those are the challenges that I'm seeing right now.
Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I think the couple that come to mind for me is aligning key stakeholders. So that's always one of the biggest challenges. You have, I think you touched at the beginning of the call, you have an owner's view, you have a general manager's view, you have a brand view, you have the revenue manager's view, and so those often are not aligned. So that's one of the biggest challenges, is trying to get everybody on the same page, back to our discussion about data and understanding what's going on. And I think the other piece is really change management. As we do evolve out of Excel, at least on our side, and move into, systems or automation or AI, there's a lot of who moved my cheese. So we're really working on, like, okay, now that we're going to be, forecasting or budgeting at every single level, it's a huge shift, not so much for revenue management, again, because on the room side, we've been doing it for years. But if you think about the other departments, I would think at most hotels, those are driver based. At least for us, it's all driver based. So now moving them into a dynamic environment is interesting. It's challenging, but it's exciting.
Yeah, for sure. So Sean, I'm going to throw this next question to you, because we did talk about this a little bit in prep, and I thought it was really interesting on how Montage approaches this. So when do you, or should a hotel, typically start the budgeting process? And what does that look like at Montage? How do you decide what's the final budget?
Yeah, so from a timeline perspective, I think we talked about in our pre-call, for us, it's fixed, right? So we owe our owners a budget contractually by November 1st. So for us, those have to be out the door November 1st. And so we really have to back into the timeline, unfortunately, which really does push us further back than would be ideal, and leads into that scenario you mentioned at the top of the call, which is redoing the budget multiple times, because obviously as each month goes, you learn more, and that changes the face of the budget potentially, as well as all the different conversations along the way. So for us, we have to start top line in August. So we start August 1st, and we give the properties a month to create the top line budget. As I said, it's only taking us days now, so it's great. We're having a lot of time to relook at it, fine tune it. As technology gets better, that does help tremendously with timelines, so they can actually start later, which is good in the month. For September, we then hand over top line to our finance folks to work through all of the various expenses and flow the entire P&L. So we give them September. And then in October, Montage International does the first blush review with all of the properties. So we go through all the properties together, do our budget review internally. Obviously, from that, there are changes. They go and make their changes. Technology, that's quick, which is great. So we can relook at things very fast now, within days, which would have taken weeks before. And then, as I said, as November 1st, out the door to our owners, we give our owners time to then review those. And then we start the review with our owners. That usually leads us into December. And then obviously we take their feedback and we do that third or fourth or fifth change into, even January or February, unfortunately nowadays. Those do tend to drag on a little bit. So it's quite a long process, but unfortunately, due to contractual obligations, we are somewhat fixed in how the timeline operates.
And how do you decide which one of those 5 budgets is the budget?
So the final budget, the approved budget, is the actual budget. But one of the interesting things that we do, which is maybe where you're trying to lead me to from our conversation, is we really ran into this problem where we have a lot of new hotels, right? So Montage has really been growing. We doubled in size during the pandemic, so we've got a lot of babies. And so we found that to be extremely challenging from a budgeting standpoint, because, we really had to lean towards what we call bank budgets, right? So we had a lot of pro formas out there, which were completely messed up based on the fact they were done pre-pandemic and the whole world was completely different. And so, I think in the pre-call, we were talking about how do you not just disenfranchise your associates from achieving their goals with lofty budgets that they could never meet, which then, disenfranchises them in the end. And then, they're not reaching towards a goal that is completely unachievable. And so we definitely ran into that at Montage. So what we did was we decided to meet in the middle. So we take that first submission that we talked about, the one that goes into Montage on October 1st, and we lock that as first submission. And then whatever the final is, 4th, 5th, 10th, 20th, whichever we finally get to, the end one, we do a blend of those two. So we call it first and final. So the goal number is the in-between number of first and final. And so we found that to be the fair way of saying, like, we took what you said, we took what other perspectives were, we blended those, and that's really what we're shooting for. And I think ultimately that leads to goals that are aggressive, but achievable ultimately. And so they're not, demoralizing in terms of like, I'm never going to hit that number.
Yeah, I think that is just so important. I think it's a great idea, what you guys have done with that from a goal perspective, because, I have been environments and in environments, I know you all have as well, where there was just absolutely no way the budget was achievable, and people start checking out, and you actually have employee turnover at that point. Once they get their bonus and they know they're not going to make it the next year, they're going to check out in April once they get their bonus for the last year and move somewhere else that's going to be more reasonable. So I think it's very important from a talent standpoint and HR standpoint that we get that right. So in an ideal world, though, Elise, when do you think, if we didn't have owners with a November 1st deadline like Montage does, when would it be the ideal process to start the budget, and why do you think that?
I really think after Labor Day, the summer season, everything is very interesting when you take a look at the summer season and you do that postmortem and say, all right, this is what leisure looked like. A lot of our hotels are pretty dependent on the leisure business. And certainly, the travel has changed. A lot of people who will go on business will also maybe take an extra 2 days. I know everybody talked about leisure as the word as we came out of the pandemic. So I think from my perspective, the latest, the best, obviously, because I would say one of the biggest challenges we have as an industry, and certainly in what we do, is time, right? We always wish we had more time. And I think when you're going back to the well and redoing a forecast 4, 5, 20 times, gosh, I hope not. But when you're doing that, you're taking your eye off the ball of the strategy of right now. And so, obviously there are things where we, certainly want to put together the right framework to set up next year for success, but I still have to get through this year, right? And so, we see a lot of people who things that I would never, not see on a day-to-day basis, but they're so busy 8 hours in the weeds redoing market segmentation, hopefully not down to the room type, but however detailed that has to be, and then putting together 100-page decks that nobody ever looks at again. I think if they at the very least hopefully have a tighter timeline. I think Sean, I think it's fantastic that there's this new tool out there that allows you to do updates quickly and the framework quickly. But I would certainly say after Labor Day, even then, because it's giving you an idea of what fourth quarter is going to look like from a pace perspective, because it's really important that that end of the year forecast is pretty solid, because a lot of people, that's what they look at, growth year over year. And so being realistic, but again, hopefully not with too many reiterations. I think the closer you get to year end, the less reiterations you probably have. And then again, allowing you to do the job that you have today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I do have one question that came in on text, actually, to me. How do you suggest you have these conversations with ownership and or asset management when, we saw a lot, of course, especially at resorts during pandemic of, just their ADR skyrocketing. And then we've normalized, but you've all said, we've normalized differently, where it doesn't look like 2019. So how do you suggest conversations with owners and asset managers go when there is this expectation that growth is going to continue? Sean, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what challenges do you see in the toolkit? And I mentioned the data challenges at a more micro level and being able to support the budget. So I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying and the challenge that we run into. because we have these asset managers or owners who go to these various shows and get this data and like, Oxford Economics told me like it's going to be great. And you're
Yeah.
like, what? So that's where I think we run into challenges is having external data that supports what we're saying at a more micro level in this bifurcation world that we're in. So I think that's been one of the hardest challenges where like I'm looking at this data. No, I'm looking at this data, right? So you get into a little bit of like, we're going to have a data off at sunrise. So that one is, that tends to be a little bit challenging. Like, what is the source of the truth and how do we really understand what the capabilities are based on our market conditions?
Yeah, absolutely.
And everything else we talked about, pools and
Yeah.
supply and new ballroom and, all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, Elise, it sounds like to me that kind of at a high level, we've got to be sure we know the story that the data is telling us, right? And be able to communicate that story without emotion. You always say math is math, right? So how do you do that, Elise? Though, first of all, how do you say math is math and you keep your emotions out of it, because people can get a little battle intensive sometimes. And how do you tell a story with data?
I think, from our perspective, right, obviously you've got a lot of different positions. It depends on who owns you, if they're public or private, because they're going to have a story that they have to speak to, whether it's, shareholders or just the family. So we have all of those different types of conversations as well. And everybody has a personal attachment to the asset in which you're representing, and then therefore saying what the future holds, right? And I will tell you, at one point, I think I had a collection of probably 20 magic 8 balls, because that was the joke, right? That, the question mark comes up as you're asking the magic 8 ball, what does the future look like? But it really is speaking to, the short term, what does the pace look like? Crossover goals is important, especially in a group house, as Sean mentioned earlier. And again, the position of where you are in the marketplace, you can achieve, and this is what success looks like. And you can always speak to the different strategies you've deployed over the last year and what is it, where have you had sat, right, in those statistics for STR, and what does that look like, right? But I think from our perspective, when we're looking forward and saying, we can't grow the ADR 8% unless we build more suites, right? It's really understanding what drives success and where are we at in the playing field. And if somebody comes out and says, oh, we need to grow by 20%, then there are times where I've gone in and said, okay, this is what 20% looks like. Is it achievable? And so I think, people have these numbers, these lofty goals in their head, and they don't really understand what does that mean on a day-to-day basis, that we're going to have to sell another 10 rooms a day on Sundays. And that, we do look at market segmentation by day and we roll it up. But one of the best use case for scenarios for that is taking a monthly goal, rolling it down and saying, okay, if you were to apply it, this is really what it means. Because if you're already sold out every Saturday, Sunday, you're leaning heavily on Sundays. And I don't think anybody has successfully answered the question for OCBI on success on Sundays, making people travel. And so it's really just, again, taking the math and saying, okay, this is what it means. How do we get there? And if we really, are you going to spend more money in marketing? Like, what are we going to do to achieve those numbers? Because you can't budget on hope, right? So that's not a viable business solution. And so I think that's really making sure the picture is clear.
For sure, for sure. So I've got two more questions. Daniel, I'm going to come back to you briefly, and then we're going to round out with the final question. You mentioned earlier that you felt like having the conversation, having more communication, more collaboration around the budget's important. Who do you think needs to be at the table for those discussions?
Yeah. Well, keep in mind too, like my background, I certainly come from more like a select service, working with management companies, third-party revenue management consulting and that sort of thing. But, folks that I would work with most closely, I mean, definitely the sales department. I did work with a lot of hotels that were extremely group heavy. They were really big group houses, and really the salesperson, I mean, their input was pretty much just like on par with, you know, the weight of me as a revenue manager, like the input that I'm putting out there. So the importance of bringing sales to the table is really, really important. I mean, for all organizations. And then increasingly too, even like marketing as well. Like increasingly I found kind of towards the tail end of my revenue management career, working a lot with like marketing teams, figuring out like, okay, what's our marketing spend going to be? You know, and kind of even forecasting sub-market segments and market segments based on like our marketing efforts for that year. So those are some of the departments that I've worked closely with, sales and marketing, that I think should definitely be at the table during that budgeting process.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to take a commercial strategy approach to it, because, you know, one of the things that we say all the time is everyone owns revenue, right? And so, you know, it's not just the revenue manager that owns the top line revenue and the director of sales. You know, everybody owns revenue. And so having that conversation, and as Sean mentioned earlier, being sure that we're aligned is critically important to the long-term success. So rapid round, 2 minutes here. So quick answers. I'll start with Elise. Is there anything that hotels can do better to prepare for the budget season?
I think really having the conversations, understanding the macroeconomics, but more importantly as well, the microeconomics in each of your markets, and then make sure it's all laid out factually. The one thing that I have always found is an emotional response isn't going to get you the response back that you want. So just use the math, and it'll tell the story and should get you there quicker than, you know, back in the day, this is how this happened kind of thing. Just tomorrow is going to look different than yesterday.
Got it. How about you, Daniel?
Quick answer, I would say cleaner data, better communication across teams.
Perfect. And Sean, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh, on this question, I'm pretty much aligned with Elise. I think, like, you know, I think we've touched on this. It's really, you know, get all your data together, line it all out, have all your facts as it relates to macro and micro and internal, and bring that all together to really tell the story. So I think that we've sort of said that throughout. And so I'll just echo that at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean, Daniel, Elise. This was terrific. And we're going to have it out to everyone within about 48 hours, a recording on YouTube, and we'll hopefully share this throughout your network, and hope that this has been beneficial for everyone who attended. Thank you for joining, and we will be in touch with a new webinar soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.